So there are few things in this world as difficult as being vulnerable. Brene Brown, who is a well-known shame and vulnerability researcher out of the University of Houston, she describes vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. We feel the pull and risk of vulnerability all the time, don't we? Our boss calls us into his office and our heart rate becomes elevated and our anxiety begins to crawl out of our stomachs up into a lump in our throat. And we wonder, am I in trouble? What did I do wrong? Is this about the project that I was late delivering? We sit down across from our boss and she can sense that we're a bit anxious. And so we're asked, are you okay? And in that moment, we're left with an option. Do we choose to be vulnerable or do we choose to cover up the anxiety? Do we say, honestly, I'm a little anxious about what this conversation is about? Or do we say, yeah, I'm great, what's up? Vulnerability in that moment is not always easy. Or maybe we have an assignment for work or school and we feel incredibly stuck. Do we have the courage to be vulnerable and to go to a colleague or a peer or a boss or professor and say, I really need some help here. I'm stuck and I'm struggling to figure out what the next step is? Or do we keep pretending and hoping that inspiration will strike at any moment? Maybe a spouse says or does something that's hurtful, and we fear that if we bring it up, it'll only uncover other issues that have gone unattended. Are we vulnerable and choose to articulate how we really feel, or do we cover it up and go on with business as usual? Or maybe we're in a situation and we have a deep sense of inadequacy or feelings of not being worthy or not belonging. But to articulate those things, to say to others, I really don't feel like I'm worth much here. Or I don't know if it's me or if it's you, but I'm not feeling like I belong. Or I'm really struggling to see if I have anything of substance to bring to the group. I feel like I'm making stuff up. To say any of these things, to be vulnerable, often feels like too much to risk. Or perhaps, on the most basic level, we don't have the courage to be vulnerable when we don't know something. Some of us have a hard time saying those three very risky words, I don't know. Vulnerability at its core is allowing ourselves to be fully seen by others. Not just the good parts, but the parts that are more difficult for us to share. The parts connected to shame or disappointment, fear, feelings of inadequacy, failures. And doing this kind of work is difficult. And it's difficult for a whole host of reasons. First, vulnerability is difficult because we don't always know all that is going on inside of us. Our emotional landscape is very complex, and sometimes the emotional freight that we bring into a situation has to do with far more than the situation at hand. For example, when I worked in church ministry in the Pacific Northwest, I would often hear complaints from those who attended our church about what they didn't like about our worship gatherings. One Sunday, an older gentleman came up to me after a worship gathering to discuss an issue he had with the songs. He didn't like them. He didn't like them at all. He said he missed the older songs, and he even threatened to leave the church over it if we didn't start singing more hymns. It was pretty clear to me by the way in which he talked and the emotion with which he talked that whatever was going on had more to do than just the songs. And so we sat down over a cup of coffee, and together we explored some of the deeper issues at hand. And it turns out that the older hymns weren't just his favorite, but they were also his late wife's favorite. And with her passing a number of years before, singing those hymns on Sunday morning was one place that he still felt connected to her. He also expressed anxiety over the changes that the church had made in the last couple of years. And it was less about whether he liked the changes or not, and more to do with he was beginning to wonder if he would be left behind as the church changed. Would the church still consider the voice of an older man as things changed? So the conversation began about song choices and worship, but it was really about the grief he still carried over his wife's death and the question of whether or not he belonged. And let's be honest, seldom are we aware of all of these undercurrents that often come out in our anxieties or worries. More times than not, we come with a concern or a worry unaware that it actually has a deeper meaning. I'm confident when this man came to me, he was coming out of a legitimate concern over the songs, and that he wasn't even fully aware of all the way that grief or the feelings of belonging or not were actually, those were the things that actually mattered to him. And this is really important when it comes to the issue of vulnerability. Oftentimes, we aren't even aware of the layers beneath what we think is the main thing. Oftentimes, the thing that receives our attention is simply the most convenient thing that we choose to identify. And it scratches the itch of the underlying issues, but never fully addresses them. And a part of the work of vulnerability is doing the deep reflective work and asking ourselves this question. Is this issue I'm worried about or bringing up, is that really what's at stake here? Or is there something beneath it that's driving all? Vulnerability is hard because to be vulnerable means we have to know what is going on. And given that we are such complex and mysterious creatures, we don't often know all that is happening within us. Vulnerability is also hard because vulnerability is a loss of control. It is an intentional act of letting go of our need to control other people's perceptions of us. And this can be terrifying. Many people don't want others to know when we're afraid or when we're ashamed or tired or frustrated or angry or sad or alone. We'd rather project some version of ourselves to give people the sense that we are more than we actually are. And I don't know if this is ingrained in us as human beings or if it's product of American exceptionalism or Western thought and influences. I don't know all of the influencing factors. But I do know that to be vulnerable is a willing commitment to let go of our control, to allow others to see us as we truly are. It means we do not get to manage how they respond to us. And the fact of the matter is, they may reject us. They may respond in ways that drive us further into places we'd rather not go. And it may be painful to experience what people say or do in response to our vulnerability. This is the hard truth. But here's the thing. When we try to control other people's perception of us, when we project some version of ourselves that isn't true to who we are, it actually perpetuates the feelings that we're trying to hide. When we cover up our fear, it only nurtures that same fear. When we cover up shame, we only give that shame more room to grow. When we hide our sadness or grief behind a veil of happiness, we are giving that sadness and grief more space to fester. This is the irony. In an effort to protect ourselves by not being vulnerable, we end up doing more damage. We end up becoming more of the thing we're trying to hide. Refusing to be vulnerable, it also robs us of the opportunity to build trust. And the math here is pretty simple. Although it's not easy, it's pretty simple. The more that we choose to be honest about who we are, the more others trust us with what they have and what we have to offer. Even if we don't like it or are a bit ashamed at what we have or don't have to give, people would prefer the authentic version of ourselves more than a contrived version. And I think we know this intuitively because it is what we receive from others, right? Most of us would prefer that others give to us their whole self, not some manufactured version of themselves. We would prefer people offer all that they are to us, and yet to do the same in return is one of the more difficult things to do ourselves. But also in this conversation around vulnerability, I think it's important to identify there are some inherent risks. Being vulnerable, particularly in places where power differentials are at play, it must be approached with some measure of discernment. We have to weigh what others may or may not be capable of holding. Or to put it another way, we need to discern the extent to which we are vulnerable with people in our lives. So I was in ministry for almost 18 years, serving as a pastor. And there was a season of my life where my family and I experienced a great deal of loss. And during that season, I had significant doubts about God's goodness, God's presence, God's activity in the world. I was angry at God. I was angry at the church. I was just plain angry. And it's really hard to be a pastor, to be a minister, when you're wondering if any of the stuff the church is about is real. But here's the thing. If I chose to be completely vulnerable to everyone in the congregation, if I allowed all of them to see what was going on within me, I think that would have been pastoral malpractice. It would have been irresponsible for me to unload all of my theological questions and concerns on others. But what I did do was I discerned those people that I trusted to walk alongside me in the darkness. There were a few friends and a few leaders who knew the full extent of my doubt, my anger, my angst. They were people who got the full picture of all that was going on. And there were others who saw a little bit less than that. I'd be honest with them that it was a difficult season, that I was struggling, but I was hanging in there. And there's a larger portion still, in fact, probably most people who, when they would ask me how I was doing, would receive the tagline, I'm hanging in there. Everyone in the world does not need to know every detail about what we're thinking or feeling. And a part of the work of vulnerability and self-reflection is discerning who are trustworthy folks in our lives, who get the full picture of us, and who are the folks who need to be more discerned around what we share or don't. This notion of vulnerability, it also is a bit of a dance in the workplace. Our livelihood is wrapped up in that space, and the risk of being vulnerable with a superior, it might be too great. So I've been working situations where I no longer trusted those who were leading, but I couldn't afford, for my family's sake, to come out and be completely honest and vulnerable about how I was feeling or how I was doing or what I was thinking about what was happening in the organization. I had to navigate the real risks of keeping or losing my job with the need to maintain some measure of integrity. I still wanted to be honest, and I also wanted to measure and weigh the concern for others and how others were being treated. And it's not easy. This is a balancing game. We also need to acknowledge that there are other cultural and systemic dynamics at play. Being vulnerable in the workplace or in the classroom or in the broader community tend to be complicated by gender or race or class. Or to put it another way, those who have traditionally and historically been at the margins of society often have more to risk in being vulnerable than those who have traditionally or historically been in positions of power and privilege. The risks of vulnerability are not the same for everyone. So how do we do it? How do we go about being vulnerable? How do we practice and engage this? First, I want to argue that we need to learn how to be honest with ourselves. We need to do the difficult work of attending to our own emotional landscape and the complexity that comes with it. We need to be constantly asking ourselves the question, okay, what is lying behind this? Why am I feeling this way? What fear or shame or felt need or core longing do I have out of which I'm responding? There are a couple of practices that might be helpful for this. One is an ancient Christian practice. It's an Ignatian practice of examen. It's a simple practice where you ask yourself at the end of every day 2 questions. The first is what brought me life, and the second is what took life from me. And it helps you pay attention to the small moments or unnoticed rhythms of your day that either connected with you, resonated with you, sort of connected with core part of who you are, or maybe it disrupted you and disturbed you. And the more you're able to attend to this part of you, the more I think you know yourself, which means you're more likely to present an authentic version of yourself to the world. Another exercise is what a former colleague of mine called taking the elevator. And it's a simple practice. You begin with identifying an unresolved conflict in your life, and it could be anything. Conflict at work or home or church, wherever. And after you've identified that, you imagine that you step into an elevator and you take it down 1 floor. And you reflect upon what actions you took in the conflict. What have you said, or what have you done in response to the conflict? Once you've identified that, you take the elevator down 1 more floor, and you reflect on the emotions that are connected to those actions. Anger, fear, sadness, disappointment, jealousy. What emotions caused you to act the way that you did? Once you've identified those emotions, you take the elevator down 1 more floor and you reflect on what core need or desire lies beneath those emotions. Is it a need to belong or to be seen? Is it a need to be understood or valued? Similar to the man at church who was upset about the worship songs, when we identify a conflict in our lives, we're likely to discover there are other things going on beneath the surface that are far more significant and at the heart of the issue than whatever small item we've actually chosen to highlight. And this attentiveness to ourselves, it is the most difficult, but I think the most important work we can do as we seek to live more authentic and vulnerable lives. We may not always choose to disclose all that is going on, I think, which is healthy. We don't need to disclose everything. But the intention is to not bury those things or remain blind to them. This is one of the biggest steps to emotional health that we can take. And another thing I want to invite you to consider that involves a bit of risk is identifying and articulating that which you bring into a conversation. If you find yourself walking into a meeting or a conversation and maybe you're anxious or you're afraid or you're nervous or sad or even perhaps you're delighted or happy, find a way to articulate that in the very beginning. You don't have to go to any great detail, but a simple statement, it goes a long way to set the tone. So imagine you've had a long and stressful day at work and you're stepping into your last meeting before you go home and you're just exhausted. Maybe you could open by saying, I want you to know I'm pretty exhausted. I'm wanting to be present with you, so I just need to be upfront with you all that I'm bringing in to the room. These little statements, they go a long way to set the stage for trust and vulnerability. In doing this, I think we not only offer the world a clear picture of who we are. Vulnerability allows the world not just to see us more clearly, we're actually creating a more beautiful and hospitable world. Then taking the smallest steps towards vulnerability, even if it is simply learning how to be more honest with ourselves, we are reflecting what we believe is central to the gospel. That is, nothing can separate us from the love of God, and that the God who holds all things together is the one who wants us as we are, not as we pretend to be. That God would rather have us with all of our cracks and our flaws and uncertainties and our fears. God would rather have that than some version of ourselves that doesn't match reality. And the fact of the matter is, that's what we want from one another as well. We want to live in a world where we don't waste energy pretending to be something we're not. We want to live in a world that is honest about things and holds the belief that in the honesty and vulnerability, that is where God brings beauty out of ashes. And it's not easy being vulnerable. It is far more of an art than it is a science. We will learn along the way. We will struggle. We will stumble. We will fail. We will inevitably be hurt at times. But we will also find those who are truly on our side. And I believe along the way, we'll discover a more beautiful world held together by God's love for all of creation.